I think we should start by talking with you, Madam Chancellor, about how you define leadership. What do you see? When you see good leadership, what does it look like? And how are principals important leaders?
Well, first of all, I think leadership is charismatic, it's enthusiastic, it's energetic, and it's based on assuming that you can't be a leader if you don't have followers behind you. So unless you know how to collaborate and you know how to do distributed leadership, you're not going to succeed very far. You may get a good press quote or not, but unless everybody in the building, or in my case the city, believes in the vision that you're projecting, you're only going to be half successful. So I think how you articulate your vision, I think communication is crucial, both in speaking and in writing. I used to have a test for people who wanted to be principals under my superintendency, that when I interviewed them, they had to write me a letter at the end of the interview, because I wanted to make sure that they could be effective communicators. And I always had to come up with an excuse, so write me a thank you letter, because people who in leadership who cannot communicate will never get where they need to go. So I think that's very important. I think you also need to have a strong sense of the principles you live by. In my case, the 4 pillars is now, every time I go to a school, principal has it hanging up. He says, and Carmen, when you look at this, it means this, this, and this. I want people to know what I expect, and I think all good leaders should have their expectations very clearly out there, and people should be able to reach those expectations. It shouldn't be something, I heard the 1/3, and we're not going to get to a half or 3/4 quickly, but the expectation is we're going to get there. And then how we get there becomes another challenge. So I think leaders also need to be nurtured, and that's why I'm so grateful to Wallace. And leaders need to go back and renew their leadership skills on a regular basis. This is not something you get and you keep. It means you nurture it, you learn from other people, and then you get even better at what you do.
In New York, we have various levels of leadership, and just for people who might not be familiar, we have you as chancellor, you also have superintendents, you have principals. Let's talk about the superintendent level, because you've made some changes there. You replaced 15 of the current superintendents out of 42, right?
Yes.
And one thing you feel is critical is that those positions, the people in those positions, have pedagogical experience, have experience in the classroom. Talk to us about those changes. What were your criteria? What's the role of those leaders, and why did they matter?
Well, I think first and foremost, if you're going to ask someone to change their practices, you have to be credible. You have to be able to say, I did that, this is how I did it, I wasn't successful, this is how you could do it better. So I think having a supervisor in any job who cannot articulate what you need to do is already a disadvantage. I was fortunate enough to meet Jody early on when I took on this job, and she very nicely said, what can we do to help? No one ever asked me, what can we do to help, without expecting a real answer on this. And I said I would like to, including the new ones we were already thinking about looking at our superintendents, I'd like to retrain all 42 of them. And we'd need a grant so that they, for the first time in the history of New York ever, and this is not an indictment of anyone, it's just the reality, we were never able to put in all the superintendents simultaneously in place. Because at one point they were chosen by their school boards, which a lot of it was patronage, not necessarily the best qualified person. Also knowing from when I was deputy chancellor before and now that depending on where the superintendent came from, some might have known some things, some knew others, but nobody knew all the things they needed to know. And I think the most frustrating things, and I heard this from parents over and over again, I want to be able to have a system as big as New York City is, it's a small town, that one phone call gets you an answer. And right now we have so many layers and principles in many cases. Well, do I call this one? Do I call that one? Do I call the other one? And generally what they ended up doing is calling me. So I could have like 1,000 emails, and I said, this is not going to work. It needs to be, and I believe in accountability. I think what all of us said about accountability is crucial. So I want superintendents to be well-trained, to be credible leaders because they've done the work, to be able to analyze and assess the principals who need more support. I think principals should be in 3 tiers. Those that you leave pretty much alone, those that you give a little bump because they just need a little support, and those that you're a little bit more vigilant in and maybe even more intrusive with because they need to bring their game up quite a bit. So I'm very pleased. I thought I know the right superintendents were chosen because there's already a little consternation out there. Oh my God, she's already visiting our school. She's meeting with, yeah, that's the job of the superintendent. One of the first things I asked them to do, I think it's great to come and have coffee with the principal, but if you don't walk the building and see what's happening in the classrooms, that's not what your job is all about. So I'm very excited about this, actually.
Jody, I'd love to have you weigh in here on what your research, because you've been studying leadership at the Wallace Foundation for about 15 years, but on the specific issue of pedagogy, experience in the classroom, what makes a great leader for a principal, or in this city where we have superintendents under a chancellor, what would you add?
Well, it's very interesting for us. I brought along a visual aid, which is a very thin publication called The School Principal as Leader, Guiding Schools to Better Teaching and Learning. And it's about 25 pages, and it took us 14 years to write it. And the reason is because at the beginning, so back in 2000, am I okay with the, okay. Back in 2000, when Wallace got into leadership, it was, believe it or not, it was controversial. Why would a foundation be putting money into leaders? And at that point, it was a big bet. And if you got a group of the top educators in a room and you asked them the same question you asked Carmen, what is a good leader? If you had 25 people in the room, you'd get 26 different answers. And so over the course of the 14 years prior to this, we not only make grants, but we study the results and evaluate the results of the grants. And so we were able, finally, after 14 years, to come up with what is lovingly called in the field the Wallace Five. And the Wallace Five are the 5 big tenets of effective leadership. And they are, and everything we've learned, by the way, which is why we love to do these panels, everything Carmen does in New York City has a basis in evidence, for national evidence, and it is her philosophy in New York City. So a great leader, the 5 of them are setting a vision for success for all students, creating a climate that's hospitable to high-quality education, cultivating leadership in leaders, and that means in great measure shared leadership and collaborative leadership. Somebody talked earlier about the solo teacher. There's also no such thing as a solo principal, and it's all about shared and collaborative leadership. The 4th one is improving instruction, and the 5th one is running all the systems and processes in the building that need to happen in order to make everything flow smoothly. So. Yeah, 14 years to come to five principals, yeah. LES. Yeah.
And to the question of experience, because this is a conversation, an issue where this administration feels a little differently from its predecessors. How important is it to have been a teacher, to have had time in the classroom? What does the data show us?
I think the data shows that it's very important. And the conversation we were having a little bit at the beginning, I would say particularly at the elementary and the middle school level, I think the verdict is out a bit on high schools, the large high schools, which are, so if you've got 3,000 students and 200 teachers, and it's impossible for a principal to have expertise in all the disciplines. But at the elementary and the middle school level, the experience around the country is very strong. It echoes everything Carmen put in place when she first began. Every district we work with, if you want to be a principal, you get your training, and you become, after 4 or 5 years being a teacher, you get your training, and then you become an assistant principal. And one of the big learnings that we have recently been promoting a lot is the important role of the assistant principal, and having the role of the assistant principal be much more consciously used by districts as a training ground for principals. And by the way, it's a very cost-effective way to train principals.
Question about the leadership in those schools. The principals are there. Let's assume that you have the principals you want in place. How much power does a principal in New York City have over his or her school? What decisions do they get to make, whether it's about appropriation of funds, what to purchase, teachers hiring and firing, et cetera?
Well, I think they have more than they used to, although when I was a principal, sometimes you make your own autonomy, and you have to have a strong belief system. Very few people were able to tell me to do something that I didn't want to do. But as I say to principals, well, I have a principal sitting in the room and knows exactly what I'm talking about. But you have to come up with evidence. It's not I want to do it because I want to do it. And the one advice I always gave principals, if you can prove to me that what you're doing is for kids, the benefit of kids, I'll follow you all the way. I think what we neglected to do is train principals to do certain things well. So for example, hiring and firing of teachers. I believe that should be part of the principal's responsibility. When I walked a building as a superintendent, one of the first things I would look for is who's the teacher who shouldn't be there the next time I came to visit. So my question to a principal would be, and what are you doing about this? And do you need help? I mean, as a superintendent, we had people who went to schools to help principals do the onerous job of writing up. And I still believe that's part of what we need to do, and part of, hopefully, what the training we're going to do with Wallace money this year. I think also in terms of how they use their money, there's a lot of autonomy. The problem is always, is there enough money? What are you autonomous with? And I think that's really very important. I just want to make one point on something Jody said. This notion about whether a principal should have been a teacher, to me, is crucial. And when I became a principal at PS6, Upper East Side, good school, but that's because the results were good, not necessarily because the teaching was good. And as I walked through my building, there were a lot of teachers who had gone there to retire. They felt they paid their dues and that they should go to the better schools. And basically, because the kids were smart, they got away with it and they didn't have to work very hard. And one of the things that I wanted to change is the way teachers taught literacy and social studies. Those are my passions, and I'll stand by them. And I had teachers who literally turned their back on me because they felt, who is she to tell us what to do? She comes from Brooklyn, as you can tell. And they were from Manhattan, which is obviously a superior place. And so what I started doing is teaching 3 classes a week, and on the condition that any teacher who wanted to come and observe me teach could come and do it. And little by little, the culture in that building changed. The principal knew what she was talking about. Principal is willing to roll up her sleeves and do it and show you. And the principal was going to come back and visit and make sure that whatever she left behind for you to do, that you're going to follow up on. So I do think it's very important.
Could I just add one thing to that? It's quite interesting. One of the big factors is the credibility of the principal with the teachers. And if you have not been a teacher, you don't have that credibility, and that's awfully important. So a state like Massachusetts, for example, where they created an alternative path where people could become principals with other degrees, whether they were social work degrees or even business degrees. And the first few people who tried it and actually became principals were rejected by their schools. So whereas they had the policy in place and people came up that alternate path, they ultimately weren't successful because the schools themselves the credibility wasn't there.
Let's talk a little bit about continuity and change. In education right now, there is so much churn. Olga pointed out the numbers on teachers and the turnover among teachers. We have it among principals. We certainly have it among superintendents, the equivalent of chancellors in the rest of the country. But in the city, where we have mayoral control, where we have a new mayor, a new chancellor, we talk a lot in the media about what's changed. Can you identify a couple of things that you want to see stay the same? Things that your predecessors put in place, innovations, philosophies, whatever, that you actually agree with and want to see continue?
Certainly, and I was part of the administration, so I certainly agreed with some of the things. I think the intent of what they wanted to do was absolutely where I want to be now. We want better teachers, better schools, better success. I think how to get there may be a little different because having been a teacher, I think the one thing that I could say with certainty, because I hear it, morale is higher. People are more willing to take risks because the fear factor is gone to some degree. And also, I do think we've done something that's really different. We put back professional development. I had it there when I was deputy chancellor, and somehow after I left, over 2 years, it was gone. You can't ask people to come and get better at Common Core, which I believe in totally. I believe better skills, better strategies. We need to get ready for the workforce of 5 years from now. But we can't ask teachers and principals to do it without any training. The business world understands you retrain as you have higher expectations. So we put back our professional development group. We put back our guidance counselor department. We put back our intervention services. These are things that were all gone. So we're adding on. In terms of going in the other direction, the progress report, I felt in every job I've had before I took on this one, that it was not giving the true picture of what a school is about. Because I look at classroom instruction. You can have an A school that's doing test prep up the gazoo, but when you go into the classroom, the kids are not learning analytical skills, they're not learning critical thinking skills, they're not talking in class. So the new way of evaluating schools, because we're still going to be accountable, we're still going to evaluate. I believe in teacher evaluation. But the evaluation of schools is going to be done on the 6 elements that the University of Chicago has done, the capacity framework, and we're sharing also with Wallace, which I think is really crucial. Rigorous instruction, building trust, collaborative teaching, working with parents. That was a big thing that we've done new. I've done 18 town halls. I have one tonight, as a matter of fact. Every Wednesday, I'm out talking to parents. Parents are not the enemy. They are partners with us. And this notion that we didn't give them information or we didn't embrace them, English is not my first language, so when I do my town meetings, I think the first few times I almost put people in shock because I said, I'll do my own translations. I think parents need to know we value them, we listen to them, and then we give them information. This Saturday, we're doing elementary school all-day conference. We have 1,500 people that signed up. We had to stop it at that. We don't have any more space. So I do think more engagement of parents, different than the past. Keeping the things that work, I think, certainly one of the things that I think the former chancellors did, and certainly Bloomberg, the increased use of technology in our schools, both by the building leaders as well as kids, is really crucial, and we need to keep doing that. So many of our schools are very old that we need to change the infrastructure, but that's certainly something I would continue. And I think looking for excellence in leadership, I think they felt that, and I felt that. We just have different ways of getting to what we think is excellence in leadership.
And when you look at schools and you talk about parents and engaging parents, one of the issues that critics see with the changes in the way you're evaluating schools is they say, well, it's not as transparent. How are parents going to know then? They can't see an A, a C, an F for a school. So how do they know if their school is doing well? And for that matter, how do they know if their teachers are doing well? What are the metrics going to be? How are people going to be evaluated? How will we know?
Well, first of all, let me be very clear that anyone who thought the report card with a letter grade was giving them accurate information is not understanding how those report cards worked. One of the worst schools I visited as a consultant was an A school. And why was it an A school? Because the kids had improved a year overall, but there was still a majority of kids at level 2. I went, and the instruction was horrific, and English language learners were not getting their fair share of what they should be getting. One of the best schools that I went to visit had a C. And this was a school, active parent engagement, phenomenal classroom interaction. In fact, the principal had called me to see if I would come talk at a PTA meeting because she was devastated with the C. And what was the problem there? The majority of her kids were level 3s but not enough had moved to level 4. And I remember talking to reporters at the time and saying, you're not doing a good job at actually explaining what these letters stand for. So I do think the new quality snapshot is actually very clear. It tells parents how their school is compared to other schools in the district and how their schools are compared to other schools in the city. And they'll be able to see that. They'll also know what the teacher satisfaction rate is, what the student achievement rate is, and it's going to be based on the words we've been using overall, well-developed, developing. So it's there, but we're also going to do a very strong campaign on how to educate parents on how to interpret the results in these snapshots.
Jody, from your experience and the research and work Wallace has done, where do you come out on the use of metrics, use of data, how they ought to be used in evaluating teachers and schools?
Well, and of course, we're on what concerns us most is the evaluation of leaders. And so the evaluation of leaders lags behind significantly to the discussion of the evaluation of teachers. And where we come out is, A, what you measure matters, and that there need to be multiple measures. And I don't think anybody can really disagree with that. And so for leader evaluation, we are looking at various measures of what makes an effective leader, which does include, first of all, this surprised me, so maybe it will surprise everybody else. When we started the work in leadership, only New York City, among the districts we work with, actually had standards of performance for leaders. What makes an effective leader? So I'm not talking about report cards, I'm talking about competencies. And so now the districts we work with have standards for leaders. What makes a good leader? How can you measure anybody's leadership ability if you don't have standards? And then the idea of measuring what principals do against those standards, and then the critical part about professional development. So it's not only professional development for teachers, it's professional development for leaders. How do you improve their performance? And ultimately, how does that relate to how the school is performing? So you look at all those factors. It's complex, but leadership is complex.
Fundamental to this whole conversation is the question of having wonderful people continue to want to be teachers. It is such a tough time out there for teachers, for principals, for everybody, just in terms of the national conversation. Lots of debate about compensation and getting rid of teachers and so on. How are we, Carmen, going to get great people in this decade and the one ahead of us, assuming it takes a while for the tenor of the discussion to change, to want to work in schools, especially those where kids come from neighborhoods of poverty, lots of families for whom they're the first generation here? What is it going to take?
Well, I think first of all, we don't have enough teachers talking about what a great job this is. And I do that all the time when I go out there. It's a craft, and it needs to go back to being a little bit more creative. One of the things that worries me about the emphasis only on test scores is that a lot of reasons people become teachers is because they're passionate about something. They're passionate about the arts. They're passionate about writing. And yet we have been so focused on test prep that we forget to let teachers have their passion. So I've been spending a lot of time. This year, I will have visited every new teacher in the city of New York by borough. So we did about 250 teachers in Brooklyn. We've done the Bronx. I'm doing it. And when I go and I talk to teachers, I give them 2 bits of advice. Number one, never have lunch in the teacher's lunchroom the first 2 months of school, because all the naysayers are in the lunchroom. Because if they weren't naysayers, they'd be working in their rooms or working with kids or whatever. And they all nod their heads, they get it. Second thing I say to them, find a teacher that you could most admire in the school, and even if you don't need the help, go ask for help. Because you need to have someone who is respected by parents and to have you under their wing and kind of tell you. I had a teacher in my building who mentored every new teacher that came in. She had grown up on the Upper East Side. She knew the culture, and I said every new teacher had to spend at least an hour a week with her the first 6 weeks of school, because there's a culture in every building. So how do you make teachers feel welcome? Teachers tend to quit around several issues. Principals who they feel don't respect them and don't even acknowledge their presence in the building. I used to do exit interviews as a superintendent, and that was the number one thing. Not the kids, not the poverty, that was number one. Number two was that they did not have a social environment in their school. You know, nobody's like me, I made no friends. I was more a social worker than I was a principal to all my new teachers, first 2 years, and I would take them out for drinks until they finally said they would continue to go out to drinks, but they'd rather I didn't join them. Perfectly okay. So how do you build a community inside a building so people want to stay and work and learn from each other? And the other thing is we have to get over, and that's why I love one of our new programs, Learning Partners, because we need teachers to open their doors, and Wallace is helping us with, to each other. For too long, teaching was a solo, and you locked the doors, and God forbid, anybody took your idea. I remember having this teacher who I wasn't too thrilled with, coming down crying. I guess I was on the job maybe 6 months, but I mean literally crying. And I said, oh my God, what happened? And she said to me, you won't believe this, you won't believe. I said, what happened? She said, someone stole my bulletin board idea. And I'm looking at her, and I said, oh, how lucky can you be? That's great, it means you did something right. And she did not respond to that. But the reality is we've become sometimes a profession that locks the door. It doesn't share their good ideas, because the thing is, if someone gets better than you, then you're going to lose something. So in this new teacher contract that we just negotiated, the teachers who got raises, and they're called model teachers, and Aileen, that's some in your school, are teachers who are opening their doors to teachers from other schools. So not just in your own building. Sometimes it's hard to be very good in your own building because there's jealous, but if you can invite people from other buildings, and these are the teachers who are getting extra money.
Final question, very quickly to both of you. Talk about partnerships with nonprofits, with community organizations, and the fact, let's start with you, Carmen, that I know despite the fact that you pretty much work 7 days a week and into the wee hours, you can't do this all by yourself.
Oh, absolutely not. Well, first of all, I've always worked with partners. I believe in the CBO's Teaching Matters as an organization I know well. I mean, you know, we work with a lot of the CBOs. I mean, some of them that I work for social emotional support is also important. I meet with them, you know, you're talking about the community schools, we work with them. I visit organizations. Today I met with all the CBECs, which are the people who are doing UPK off-site, not in our public schools.
What's UPK?
The CPK, CBECs.
Oh, sorry.
They're the ones who are not in public school buildings. They're almost all CBOs of some kind or another. So we need everybody to help, and certainly I'd love everyone in this room to help. We have been working with many organizations and businesses. We have a partnership now. Kathy Weil is working with us to create more CTE schools in the city. So I think this is everybody's business. New York has to help New York become the best city in the world, particularly in public education.
And specifically the role of philanthropy, or the role of philanthropy the way Wallace defines it, one of the things people are pretty shocked to hear generally is philanthropy is a very, very small proportion of the overall education budget in the United States. It's something like 0.4% of all the money spent in education. And the question for a foundation is, how do you have impact? And as Arnie Duncan shared with our board, it may be a very small percentage nationally, but it is an enormous impact, an enormous opportunity, because that 0.4%, nevertheless, is innovation. And most of the education funds are committed for staff costs, for capital costs. So philanthropy can have a very major impact, and what we do at Wallace is we try to find what we think, we call it a high leverage knowledge question. What don't we know that if we knew it could lead to a breakthrough? And that's how we got to leadership, and that's how we got to giving grants to districts like New York, and they get better, but we also get to study what they do, and we learn lessons, and then what we seek is a broad impact so that we evaluate what we do. We have here's the commercial, folks, a wonderful website, www.wallacefoundation.org, where you can find this wonderful report, among many others. And, you know, we are looking to have lessons that are used throughout the country for school districts and universities that never get our money.
And I need to say that philanthropy is not just money. In fact, in many cases, it isn't. It's about time. And the most precious thing that anybody has is time. And one of the things we're working on is that we would like to have companies and organizations adopt all our middle schools. I'm on a crusade for middle schools. Our most vulnerable kids are in middle school. And I would love to have middle school kids with internships that are paid, but mentorships. And more of a person, a one-to-one connection with a child. Urban Assembly does this particularly well in their schools, where they partner someone from freshman year right through 4 years of high school. So don't think of it just in terms of money, but how can you give time and energy to public education, to education in general.
Well, I think that's a great way to end. We have our marching orders here. Thank you very much, Jody, and best of luck to you, Chancellor.
Thank you.